So, The Power Elite was Mill's most influential book. It influenced every discipline, not just sociology, and was read widely by the public. He was writing in 1956, remember, and when Mills was writing, there was a denial by most that a power elite existed in the US. The US was supposed to be a class-less society, no classes. I asked you in your learning objectives to know who the power elite are. The power elite are the highest political leaders, including the president and a handful of key cabinet members and close advisors, major corporate owners and directors, and high ranking military officers. This was in the chapter that you read. To be elite, it's not just about having money, and it's not just about your individual personality. I direct you to page 9 and 10 here in the chapter. You have to occupy a certain position and have access to institutions in order to become and secure your place in the power elite. Mills argued that the U.S. was ruled by a power elite, that they dominate through their connections with each other, through interlocking directorates, which we'll take a look at. And the elite would make decisions and influence laws and policies that help to ensure that they stay in power, even when those decisions were not good for most of society. Power elite theory is counter to pluralism. Pluralism was the idea that different groups in society represent different interests and can lobby the government with those different interests. So there were a couple of problems with pluralism. Pluralism assumes that we all have equal representation and that no one particular group dominates. Pluralism represents more of an idea of the way things should work versus political reality. Critics of pluralism asked, is power really equally distributed in society? Do the working and lower income classes in society really have as much power as the wealthy upper economic and political classes? Is the federal government really responsive to all groups equally? And is the federal government really neutral? So does a student in CUNY, for example, have as much say in decisions as the president of Harvard? Mills notes that throughout his book and other chapters, there are different types of elite, and some are more powerful than others. Celebrities are a kind of elite. Intellectuals are a kind of elite. These are, folks that belong to elite classes, but they're not the power elite. And oftentimes, they're working for the power elite or under their control. And for some, that's how they secured their position, how they got there. For that discussion, you can take a look at the more recent work by William Domhoff. William Domhoff was a social psychologist who had access to the elite because he was he studied dreams, and so he was a therapist to the elite. But then he started studying. He was interested as he was in these elite clubs, working with among the power elite and other elite individuals. He became interested in their networks, and so he studied network analysis. And you can go to his website for lots of resources on looking at how he's connected everyone. Hofstadter's book on anti-intellectualism in American life is also useful here. Now, I want you to watch this film directed by Jamie Johnson, heir to Johnson & Johnson. And as you watch, relate what you hear in these clips to the chapter from The Power Elite. What American values does this film challenge and how? And what aspects of the power elite are illustrated? So we'll just watch a segment of it.
Okay, this is a room that nobody's probably walked into for the past 10 plus years. It's a little time capsule, if you notice, by the Madonna clock and my interesting attempt at color painting, the homage to Poison and Motley Crue, the 90210 posters, little, I think they were trading cards that were stickers, and the Bon Jovi sort of wall. This was my bed. It's a little small for me now. Probably why I don't stay in here anymore, but yeah.
And what floor are we on?
We are on the 68th floor. Not a bad view to wake up to.
Things really changed more when I went away to secondary school, went to St. Paul's. I was really into experimenting and different drugs and drinking, and so I was just kind of a mess. I was weird. I mean, some of my friends tell me about how I used to just go off in the woods and climb up to the very top of a tree and sort of make weird noises and scare people.
I mean, the first time I tried LSD was the summer between 6th and 7th grade. And I look at some of the crap some of my friends were involved in. Like this whole gangster thing that we all went through. Like our incredibly precocious drug habits that we just made it, such a point of flaunting to the world. Not that I was against the drug habits. I mean, I was one of the more precocious. These are, 2 small, elite New York private schools, and then at St. Paul's there's boarding school, which is just a bastion of historical snobbery. I mean, it's just all there, If you ever have an encounter that rubs you the wrong way, someone ever pisses you off, and I'm up at boarding school, and this kid's from, some shit town in Connecticut, I don't know. I can just say, fuck you, I'm from New York. I can buy your family, piss off. And this is petty, and this is weak, and this is very underhanded, but it's so easy,
My parents had come up to visit me during Parents' Weekend of that fall, which sort of coincided with my 18th birthday. And my dad brought up all this paperwork, things I had to sign. I had to look over my will, things I'd never thought about before. And this was the time when I was trying to think about college, what I wanted to do after high school. The idea that I was a millionaire, knowing I was a millionaire, it's kind of hard to accept, I think, when you're a kid and you haven't done anything yet, but you have all of this. And while all you have other friends who don't have anything. They just have their little checking account with the money they earned from summer jobs. Put it this way, I'm a multi-millionaire. I have an income in the high 6 figures minimum per year. And then I make roughly $50,000 a year in my current job.
To St. Paul's, I drove up with the chairman of the board of trustees from there. He was my dad's best friend at the time. The second day of school, the headmaster, who every student hated because he was such a prick, came up to me and personally introduced himself. Just things like these you tend to notice, And then Brown, forget about it. I think on some level I got in there on my own merit. I had really good boards. I had really good grades in high school. But that's almost incidental because I feel pretty sure I would have gone there anyways. I attended the entire of my first academic year, I think less than 8 academic obligations total. And that includes tests and exams. So including tests and exams, I physically got up and went somewhere for something having to do with class less than 8 times. And I get these kind of really invasive letters from deans saying, though you are technically, below the number of credits, required, for continuing education at Brown University, we do feel that with continued academic progress, you will da-da-da-da and da-da-da. I'm just oh, Jesus. You guys can't throw me out, can you? This is ridiculous. So again, thank you, great, phenomenal.
I showed up at Trinity College in the fall of 1994 for a couple weeks, and college is just out of control. I'd had all these problems with depression, and I was quitting the sports teams and sitting around in my room and not really reading the books I was supposed to be reading in school. And my parents came up, and we both decided that I was going to take some time off. At first I thought it was going to be a semester or 2, or the whole year, and it ended up being about 2 years. Probably the best 2 years of my life, the most important years of my life. One of the jobs I had was working in an oil field services company down in Texas. I I was working with Cajuns and Hispanic guys who'd never even been to high school. And here I was, this kid who'd been to all these fancy boarding schools, and I was an alien to them. And it was hard at first. But I think they also learned some things from me. You know, lunchtimes they'd always be asking me all these questions and kind of trivia questions. They'd get a kick out of that I knew a lot of these things, you know. To know what the capital of Chile is or something. In my mind, I knew it was Santiago, but I went on a fly fishing trip with my dad down there in the mountains, and I'm going around on helicopters, going from pool to pool. Really what I learned is that working hard makes me feel good.
When my dad was my age, he thought he'd have a career at Johnson & Johnson. But my grandfather told him he couldn't work there because he didn't want family issues interfering with business. Plus, he knew that my dad would never need to earn a living. I guess at that point, my dad could have just gone on permanent vacation. But for some reason, he didn't. Like my dad, I'll never need to work. And I'm not much of a painter. So I want to ask him what he thinks I should do with my life.
After graduation, you might pursue the filming a little bit, but you might also get interested in graduate school, further studies, building a collection of historic documents, papers, publications. And
As a career?
yes.
Okay.
Oh, this is a beauty. This is a map. This is one of my favorites. Map of Washington Township. My God. Look at that. And look at the way this little tiny portion of pink down in the lower right corner outlines the lot and the block.
I don't know. Collecting old maps seems pretty cool. But I don't exactly see where the career part comes into it.
Hand-colored.
Oh, yeah.
The bottom line is, I gotta do something.
An example of this before?
And there are no courses in college about how to be a hardworking and productive rich person. It's something you gotta figure out for yourself.
Well, considering I don't have to work, what advice would you give me on?
Then don't work. Then don't work. Why would anybody in their right mind work unless they had to?
Now, you can go on YouTube and watch the rest of this documentary, but again, think about what aspects of the power elite it reveals. And think about the sociological and psychological characteristics of the power elite that this film gets at. You notice that there's a degree of denial in wealth and sort of hiding of it in the parent and children interactions. For the 1% and for what scholars call the super rich, it's faux pas to talk about money. These cultural norms can contribute to their choices with their children and what they discuss and how they discuss it. As Mill states, there's a tendency for privileged people to deny that they have any advantage. So take a look at page 14 of your chapter from The Power Elite. Mill states, people with advantages are loath to believe that they just happen to be people with advantages. They come readily to divine themselves as inherently worthy of what they possess. They become to believe themselves naturally elite, and in fact to imagine their possessions and their privileges as natural extensions of their own elite selves. In this sense, the idea of the elite as composed of men and women having a finer moral character is an ideology of the elite as a privileged ruling stratum. And this is true whether the ideology is elite-made or made up for it by others. And then on page 17, more generally, American men of power tend by convention to deny that they are powerful. No American runs for office in order to rule or even govern, but only to serve. He does not become a bureaucrat or even an official, but a public servant. And nowadays, as I have already pointed out, such postures have become standard features of public relations programs of all men of power. So he's also referencing the very effective public relations team the power elite have. That rhetoric is so effective that they may come to believe their own rhetoric, whether it is true or not. Later, we'll also hear from Tim Wise. One of the things that Tim Wise talks about is that if you have privilege, you don't notice it. It's invisible to you. It's like being so-called an able-bodied person. You don't notice accessibility or inaccessibility of a building unless you have to make a conscious effort to be aware of it. So anybody who wasn't in a wheelchair before or wasn't on crutches before, for example, and then they are because of an injury, then you notice. Then you notice that a building may or may not have an easy, accessible way to get from floor to floor or room to room. And the amount of effort that it takes, you have to get up earlier and you have to put in so much more effort to deal with that issue of accessibility. There's actually a book that writes about this, the inequality that is inherent within architecture. So if you look at libraries, for example, a lot of times much of the thinking has gone into the beauty of it. In many libraries, you have to go up a set of stairs, a huge, beautiful case of stairs just to get to the main floor. And accessibility is sort of an afterthought. And that's not something that we notice if we don't have to, if it's not apparent to us. More on the sociological and psychological elements of the power elite, Mills argues that the power elite tend to think alike. And where does that stem from? The power elite are part of the same social clubs and receive education from the same kinds of schools. They have similar experiences. They often come from legacies, and that promotes a similar way of thinking among them. The power elite also are not very diverse. William Domhoff does track this and the times when there is more diversity among the power elite and who is welcomed in at different times. Domhoff also asked, and his book is called Who Rules America, and he's written several updates to that. But he asks, what produces the acceptance of this worldview? Participants in the elite tend to read the same newspapers, join the same clubs, live in the same neighborhoods, send their children to the same schools, usually private, and the ones they themselves attended, and belong to the same churches and charities. They work and play together, employ one another, and intermarry. They share, in a word, a lifestyle that brings them together in mutually reinforcing contact. Moreover, they undergo similar apprenticeships. Dye, that's D-Y-E, finds that 54% of the top corporate leaders and 42% of our highest political officials went to just 12 private colleges, including Yale, Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford. Mills and Domhoff both found that social clubs are very important for the social upper class. Clubs are cut off from the rest of the public by high initiation fees, annual membership dues, and other expenses. There's a rigorous screening process. You have to know someone or multiple someones to get recommendations. And if a couple of people don't want you in that club, you're not going to be able to join. So we're talking about elite clubs like Bohemian Grove, Lynx Club in New York, Somerset Club in Boston, California Club. And at these clubs, many presidential candidates, this is where they reveal their intentions to run. There's an image here of George H.W. Bush using lakeside talks to extol the virtues of his son, George W. Bush, becoming the future president. There are also interlocking directorates. The power elite hold positions on multiple boards of directors and are part of the same professional networks. They may hold a position of some importance in their own companies, but because of these interlocking directorates, they have influence in other companies as well. Power was not always as concentrated in the US as it is today. And this is something that Mills talks about. Something happened historically that mobilized the business community and the power elite community to seek out greater political control. Something threatened them that caused them to close ranks. First, there was communism. Mills is writing during the Cold War era. There was a fear that their power would be threatened. And then later there's the civil rights movement. By the early 1970s, we saw a trend towards greater racial equality. The power elite felt they were losing power. The masses had revolted. They were successful in creating change. To every social movement, there is a counter movement. The backlash to the civil rights movement involved the Reagan administration's cuts to the civil rights program. Domhoff shares with us that the power elite responded to a threat of the civil rights movement in many different ways. We saw this too if you look at some of the reports at some of these wealth conferences in the language that they're using to respond to the Occupy movement. But Domhoff is looking at how they responded to the civil rights movement. So business leaders take a more aggressive role in national politics. They began mobilizing campaigns to motivate business leaders, stockholders, depositors, suppliers, and dealers to lobby Congress. The Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute were founded, and they received financial backing from the wealthy. Both of these are a think tank that produce reports to support the goals of the power elite. There was a recent one arguing that poverty isn't so bad in the US. So if you look at Richard Hofstadter's work on anti-intellectualism in the US and some of Domhoff's recent work on the power elite, you can see the circle of experts that sort of give validity to what the power elite want to argue and what policies they want to support. And why hasn't there been more of a challenge to the power elite in the US? Mills addresses this on page 12. He states that they remain hidden. In terms of looking at historical periods and comparing the US to other countries, there was never a feudal epoch in the US. So the control of the power elite is more subtle. We're more vulnerable to mythical ideologies like meritocracy, a moralistic interpretation of their position, that they're naturally smarter. These are individualistic ideologies, and all of these support the power elite staying in power. So there's ideological support for the sustenance of the power elite. There are also two views of the power elite that the public generally does understand. So Mills covers this towards the end of his chapter. He states that, one, the public either believes that the power elite are omnipotent, they control everything, or two, they're completely disorganized and don't know what the hell they're doing. To Mills, neither of these views are satisfactory models for studying the power elite. For Mills, it's about degrees of power. So you can have an elite, again, like celebrities, like lower ranking members of military or law enforcement, and they have some power, but they don't have as much power as the top three. The elite at the top will organize to suit their interests, but they're not always organized all the time. They're not always in agreement. And this is what he means at the top of page 20, where he states that the power elite are not always unified, they're not always coordinated, they may or may not bind together as a community. It depends on the historical period and what is happening sociologically, economically, and politically. None of this means that there is no power elite. It just has to do with those circumstances that, again, would cause them to close ranks and recognize themselves as a community. It varies. So Mills is providing for us a much needed model for how to study the power elite where there was none before. So reread the power elite, make sure you understand these points, take the quiz, and then you can go from there.